Imagine a cold so absolute it feels like a physical presence, a weight on your chest, a needle in your lungs with every breath. Imagine a silence broken only by the whip of the wind and a strange crystalline cracking sound. It is not the sound of a frozen river shifting under its own weight. It is the sound of a human being, layer by layer, being turned into a grotesque work of art. The skin, then the muscle, then the bone, all succumbing to a temperature that does not simply kill, but preserves the final moment of agony for all to see. This was not a freak accident of nature. This was a punishment, a method of execution, and most chillingly, a form of public communication in the icy hell of the Kolyma Gulag. A man, stripped naked and doused with bucket after bucket of water in -50-degree weather, would become a frozen statue, an object lesson left for his fellow prisoners to contemplate as they marched to the gold mines. What kind of system, what kind of ideology could conceive of such a fate? And what does it tell us about the human capacity for cruelty when the state itself not only permits but orchestrates the transformation of a living man into a monument of frozen terror? To understand how a man could become an ice sculpture, you must first understand the system that created him. The Gulag was not merely a network of prisons, it was the dark, beating heart of Stalin's Soviet Union. It was an economic engine powered by slave labor and a political weapon designed to atomize society, to crush dissent before it could even form. After the revolution, Lenin had established camps for political opponents, but it was under Joseph Stalin that the system metastasized into the behemoth known as the Main Camp Administration, or Gulag. Following the collectivization of agriculture and the brutal dekulakization campaigns, millions of peasants, branded as kulaks, were swept into this network. Then came the Great Purge of the 1930s, when the machine turned on the party itself. Old Bolsheviks, military commanders, intellectuals, artists, engineers, anyone could be denounced. A careless joke, a foreign acquaintance, a momentary lapse in revolutionary fervor could earn you a visit from the NKVD, a swift trial, and a sentence under the infamous Article 58 of the Soviet Criminal Code, a catch-all for any perceived counter-revolutionary activity. The antagonist in this story is not a single man, but the system itself, impersonal, insatiable, and ruthlessly logical in its own paranoid framework. The protagonist is the Zek, the prisoner, stripped of his name, his past, and his humanity, reduced to a number and a pair of hands to dig for gold until he died. Among all the circles of this industrial hell, one name was whispered with a unique kind of dread: Kolyma. Located in the Russian Far East, a region larger than France and Spain combined, Kolyma was geographically isolated and climactically hostile. It was a land of permafrost, where the ground remained frozen year-round and winter temperatures regularly plunged to -60°C. They called it the White Crematorium, or the Pole of Cold and Cruelty. Its sole purpose was to extract resources, primarily gold, which was essential for funding Stalin's rapid industrialization and military buildup. The state enterprise responsible, Dalstroy, operated with near-total autonomy. Its head was both the economic director and the supreme authority over the lives and deaths of hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The logic was simple and brutal. A prisoner was a unit of labor. The state calculated that the cost of transporting a new prisoner to Kolyma was cheaper than the cost of feeding and clothing an existing one adequately for more than a single mining season. The entire system was predicated on disposability. There was no pretense of rehabilitation. There was only extraction of gold from the earth and life from the men who dug it. The journey to Kolyma was the first filter, a brutal overture to the horrors that awaited. For a man like our composite prisoner, whom we can call Sergei, a former teacher from Leningrad arrested for owning a book by a disgraced poet, the ordeal began in a packed prison cell. Then came the transport. He and hundreds of others were crammed into unheated cattle cars, the Stolypin wagons, for a journey that could last weeks, even months. The doors were bolted shut. A single hole in the floor served as a latrine. Food was a salted fish and a sliver of bread tossed in periodically. Water was scarce and often frozen. The air grew thick with the stench of sweat, excrement, and death. Men went mad from thirst, from claustrophobia, from the incessant rocking of the train. Fights broke out over a crust of bread. The weak were trampled underfoot. By the time the train reached the port of Vladivostok, dozens in Sergei's car alone had already perished. Their bodies were simply left among the living until the next stop, a grim foreshadowing of the disposability of human life that was the core principle of Kolyma. From Vladivostok, the journey continued by sea. Prisoners were packed into the holds of steamships, vessels like the SS Jurma, which became infamous as a floating graveyard. The conditions below deck were even worse than the trains. In the darkness of the hold, another insidious element of the Gulag system asserted itself, the power of the Urkas. These were the professional criminals, thieves, murderers, and gangsters who were also imprisoned in the Gulag. The camp administration often empowered these violent criminals to terrorize and control the politicals, the prisoners sentenced under Article 58. The Urkas operated by their own brutal code, the thieves' law. They stole the politicals' meager rations, their warmer clothing, and any personal items they had managed to hide. On the ships, they enacted a horrific ritual of plunder. A political prisoner might be forced to surrender his coat, a death sentence in the climate they were heading to. Resistance was met with a beating or a knife in the dark. The guards turned a blind eye. This was part of the system's design, to break any solidarity among the prisoners, to set them against one another, to ensure that the only hierarchy that mattered was the one imposed by the camp authorities and their violent proxies. Upon arrival at Magadan, the port city and administrative center of Kolyma, the prisoners were confronted with the reality of their new world. The air itself was a weapon. Even in the summer months, it was cold enough to cause pain. In winter, it was a constant, lethal threat. From Magadan, they were marched or trucked hundreds of kilometers inland along the Kolyma highway, a road built on the bones of the prisoners who had come before them. The camps themselves were little more than clusters of flimsy wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. Sergei, like all the others, would have been stripped of his civilian clothes and issued standard camp attire. A padded jacket known as a telegraika, Valenki felt boots and foot wraps. This inadequate clothing was often old, tattered, and barely sufficient to protect against the mildest winter day, let alone the deep, biting cold of the Kolyma nights. The central mechanism of destruction in Kolyma was the work quota, a concept known as tufta. Each prisoner was assigned a daily task, typically moving a certain number of cubic meters of frozen earth in the gold mines. The work was done with primitive tools, picks, shovels, and wheelbarrows. The permafrost was as hard as rock, often requiring explosives to break it up. The daily quota was set at a level that was physically impossible for a well-fed, healthy man to achieve, let alone a starving, exhausted prisoner. And here was the satanic genius of the system. Your food ration was directly tied to your work output. If you met 100% of your quota, you received a full ration, a meager portion of watery soup, and about 600 grams of bread, barely enough to sustain life. If you only managed 50%, your ration was cut in half. This created a death spiral. Less work meant less food meant less energy meant even less work the next day. A prisoner who consistently failed to meet his quota was officially classified as a doko diaga, a goner. This was not just camp slang, it was a formal administrative category. These men were walking skeletons, their bodies consumed by starvation and exhaustion, their minds hollowed out by despair. They moved slowly, shuffling through the snow, their eyes vacant. Everyone knew they were marked for death. They were the living ghosts of Kolyma, a constant reminder to every other prisoner of the price of slowing down. Life in the barracks offered no respite. Overcrowded and poorly heated, they were breeding grounds for disease. Lice were a constant plague, spreading typhus, which could sweep through a camp and kill thousands. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was rampant. Men's teeth fell out, their gums bled, and old wounds reopened. Dysentery turned the latrines into pits of death. Medical care was a farce. The camp doctor was often a prisoner himself, with few supplies and no real ability to treat the systemic illnesses of starvation and frostbite. A visit to the infirmary was seen as a temporary stay of execution at best. The psychological toll was just as severe as the physical one. Men who had been professors, poets, and scientists were reduced to a state of primitive survival. The past was a dream, the future an impossibility. The only reality was the gnawing hunger in the belly, the searing cold in the bones, and the unending, pointless labor. Hope was the most dangerous contraband, for it only made the reality more painful. The smart ones, the survivors, learned to kill it, to exist only in the present moment, to focus on one thing and one thing only: how to get through the next hour without dying. In this environment, the line between man and beast blurred. Hunger drove prisoners to eat anything: leather from their boots, moss, tree bark, rats. Some even dug up the corpses of buried camp horses to gnaw on the frozen flesh. The moral universe collapsed. A man might kill another for his bread ration. Friendships were a liability. Trust was a fatal mistake. The guards, for their part, were often as brutalized as the prisoners they tormented. Many were conscripts, trapped in this frozen wasteland, their own humanity eroded by the absolute power they wielded over the condemned. They derived entertainment from cruelty. They would throw a piece of bread into a crowd of docodyagas and watch them fight over it like dogs. They would make prisoners stand outside in the freezing cold for hours as punishment for a missing button. And sometimes, for a particularly serious offense, or perhaps for no reason at all, just to remind everyone who was in charge, they would decide to make an example. They would decide to make a statue. The chosen victim could be anyone. Perhaps it was a prisoner who had attempted to escape, a futile act in the vast, empty taiga. More likely, it was someone who had committed a lesser crime, stealing a handful of gold dust in a desperate attempt to barter for food, talking back to a guard, or simply collapsing from exhaustion one too many times. Let us imagine it is Sergei, our former teacher. He has become a docodyaga, his body emaciated, his mind clouded by hunger. In a moment of delirium, he refuses an order to lift a rock that is clearly beyond his strength. The guard sees this not as a sign of weakness, but as an act of defiance, of sabotage. This cannot be tolerated. The camp commandant is informed. The sentence is pronounced not in a courtroom, but with a casual nod. Make an example of him, the commandant says, before returning to his warm office. The process begins at dusk, as the other work brigades are shuffling back to the camp. It must be a public spectacle. 2 guards grab Sergei. He is too weak to resist. They drag him to a prominent spot near the main gate, where every prisoner will have to pass him. The temperature is already well below -40. The air is so cold, it burns the throat and freezes the moisture in your eyeballs. The guards are laughing, making jokes. To them, this is a diversion from the crushing monotony of their existence. First, they strip him naked. The shock of the frigid air on his emaciated body is instantaneous and excruciating. His skin, already stretched taut over his bones, erupts in goosebumps. He begins to shiver violently, an involuntary muscular reaction, as his body makes a final, desperate attempt to generate heat. The other prisoners are herded into formation to watch. They stand in silence, their faces grim, their eyes downcast. They cannot look away. They are forced to bear witness. To show any sign of sympathy would be to risk joining him. Then comes the water. A guard hauls a wooden bucket filled from a nearby stream, a thin layer of ice already forming on its surface. He walks up to Sergei, who is now shaking uncontrollably, his teeth chattering with a sound like castanets. The guard throws the first bucketful. The water hits Sergei's chest and back. For a fraction of a second, where the near-boiling temperature of his skin meets the near-freezing water, steam rises. But almost immediately, the water begins to freeze, forming a thin, translucent glaze over his torso. It is a horrifyingly intimate moment. The cold is no longer just in the air around him. It is now physically bonded to him, a second skin of ice. Sergei lets out an inhuman howl, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. It is a sound the other prisoners will hear in their nightmares for the rest of their short lives. The second bucket follows, and a third. The guards are methodical. They pour the water slowly now, directing it to ensure an even coating. They are sculptors, and their medium is living flesh. The initial layer of ice thickens, becoming opaque. Sergei's screams become weaker, muffled by the forming casket. His limbs, which were thrashing wildly, begin to stiffen. The ice is working its way inward, chilling the muscle, slowing the blood. His mind, which had been a firestorm of pain and terror, begins to dim. He might see flashes of his past life, his wife's face, the smell of books in his study, a warm summer day in Leningrad. These are the last embers of his humanity before the cold extinguishes them forever. He is losing consciousness, but not all at once. It is a horrifying descent, a series of brief awakenings into a reality of absolute cold and encroaching paralysis. The guards continue their work, perhaps positioning his arms in a specific pose for dramatic effect. Maybe they force his head up, so his final expression is one of supplication or defiance, a detail left to the whim of his tormentors. His breathing becomes shallow, ragged. Each intake of air is like swallowing razors. The moisture in his lungs begins to crystallize. His heart, struggling to pump thickening, sludgy blood, beats erratically and then, finally, slows to a stop. The exact moment of death is impossible to pinpoint. It is not a single event, but a process. At some point, the shivering stops completely. The man inside the ice is gone, but the guards are not finished. They throw another few buckets for good measure, to build up the thickness of the ice, to ensure their creation is solid and will last. What stands before them now is no longer Sergei, the teacher from Leningrad. It is a monument to the power of the state, a statue of a man, his form vaguely visible through the cloudy ice, his face a frozen mask of agony. The work is complete. The warning has been delivered. In the immediate aftermath, there is only silence. The guards, their amusement spent, dismiss the prisoners back to their barracks. No one speaks. The image of the frozen man is seared into their minds. For the next several days, perhaps even weeks, the ice statue remains at the gate. It becomes part of the landscape of the camp. Every morning, the prisoners march past it on their way to the mines. Every evening, they march past it on their return. The weak winter sun glints off its surface. At night, it stands as a ghostly sentinel under the aurora borealis. It is a constant, silent sermon on the futility of resistance and the cheapness of their own lives. They are all just one misstep away from becoming a similar work of art. The psychological effect is devastating. It reinforces the core lesson of the Gulag. You are not a person. You are an object, a resource to be used and discarded at the whim of the state. The disposal of the body, when it finally comes, is as profane as its creation. When a high-ranking official is scheduled to visit, or when the guards simply grow tired of looking at it, the statue is decommissioned. There is no solemnity. A few guards take sledgehammers or axes to the figure. The sound of the blows is sickening, a dull, heavy crunch as the ice shatters, mixed with a deeper, more resonant crack as the frozen, brittle bones and flesh break apart. They are not dismantling a corpse, they are demolishing a structure. The fragments, pieces of ice mingled with chunks of frozen human tissue, are shoveled into a cart. They are then hauled to the edge of the camp and dumped into a shallow, unmarked mass grave, where they will join the shattered remains of countless others. There is no name, no marker, no prayer. Sergei's existence is not just ended, it is erased. The final act of violence is to deny that he ever mattered at all. It would be a mistake to view this horrific practice as an act of simple, sadistic pleasure. While the individual guards may have been cruel, the freezing of prisoners was a logical extension of the Gulag's entire philosophy. It was a tool of terror, calculated and efficient. In a system where death by starvation, exhaustion, and disease was commonplace, a normal death lost its power to intimidate. The administration needed something more spectacular, something that would cut through the numbness and reignite fear in the hearts of the Zeks. The ice statue was performance art as statecraft. It communicated the absolute and arbitrary power of the camp authorities in a language that every prisoner, regardless of their background, could understand. It was a way to dehumanize the victim completely, turning him from a subject into an object, and in doing so, reminding every witness of their own precarious status. This was not a flaw in the system, it was the system functioning perfectly. The psychology of the perpetrators is a chilling study in itself. How could ordinary men commit such acts? The answer lies in a process of systemic dehumanization that affected both guard and prisoner. The Zeks were not referred to as people. They were enemies of the people, parasites, counter-revolutionaries. This relentless propaganda, drilled into the guards from the moment they arrived, created a moral distance. It reframed the prisoners as a subhuman threat that needed to be controlled and eliminated, not as fellow human beings. Furthermore, the guards themselves were trapped. They were stationed in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, subject to their own harsh discipline. Participating in the system's cruelty was a way to align themselves with power, to ensure their own survival, and to vent their own frustrations and misery onto those even lower in the hierarchy. They were cogs in a machine that ran on cruelty, and their own humanity was one of the first things the machine ground down. The system did not just kill prisoners, it murdered the souls of their keepers. After Stalin's death, and especially following Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956, the Gulag system was slowly dismantled. Millions were released in a series of amnesties. But the violence did not end there. It simply changed form. For decades, the Soviet state engaged in a campaign of post-mortem violence against the victims of the Gulag. It sought to erase their memory. The very existence of Kolyma's horrors was denied. Official records were destroyed or locked away. The memoirs of survivors, like Varlam Shalamov's harrowing Kolyma tales or Alexander Solzhenitsyn's monumental The Gulag Archipelago, were banned and circulated only in secret, as samizdat. To speak of the Gulag was to risk rearrest. This was an attempt to murder history itself, to pretend that the ice statues, the mass graves, and the millions of shattered lives had never existed. It was the final indignity. To deny the victims their suffering, to gaslight an entire nation, and to ensure that the ghosts of Kolyma would remain silent. The ultimate irony of the system is that it was insatiable, eventually turning on its own creators. Many of the original architects and chief administrators of the Gulag, like NKVD head Genrik Yagoda, met their end in the very system they had perfected. They were arrested, tortured, and condemned as enemies of the people, replaced by even more ruthless functionaries who in turn would often meet the same fate. The machine that demanded human sacrifice was indiscriminate. It taught a brutal lesson. In a system of absolute, arbitrary power, no one is safe. The man who gives the order to make an ice sculpture today may find himself the raw material for one tomorrow. The terror was designed to be all-consuming, a fire that, once lit, would burn everyone it could reach, from the lowest Zek to the highest commissar. We return, then, to that frozen figure, standing silently at the camp gate. It is more than just a testament to a historical atrocity. It is a permanent and profound warning. It is a symbol of what happens when an ideology values an abstract concept, the state, the revolution, the purity of the race more than the individual human life. It is the end point of dehumanization, the logical conclusion of a rhetoric that labels fellow citizens as enemies, vermin, or obstacles to progress. The methods have changed. We no longer, in most parts of the world, freeze people into statues. But the underlying mechanism of that horror persists. It persists when we see political opponents not as people with different views, but as existential threats to be silenced and removed. It persists in the online mobs that swarm to destroy a person's reputation and livelihood, turning them into a public example, a digital ghost to haunt anyone who might dare to transgress. The technology is new, but the impulse to cast someone out, to make them an object of scorn and a warning to others, is as old as humanity itself. The story of Kolyma and its frozen men forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the fragility of civilization. The veneer is thin. The institutions and norms that protect us from such barbarism are not laws of nature. They are conscious choices, agreements that must be constantly renewed and defended. The Gulag was not a medieval relic. It was a modern, industrial system created by an educated, technologically advanced society in the 20th century. It is a stark reminder that progress is not inevitable and that humanity has an immense capacity for calculated, systematic cruelty. To look at the ice statue of Kolyma is to look into an abyss of human potential. It should horrify us, it should disgust us, but most of all, it should serve as a warning, frozen in time, of the world we must never allow to be built again, a world where a man can be turned into a thing, and where the cracking of ice is the sound of a human soul being extinguished.